G'day, it's Jimmy Bartell.
And Bruce Eva. Our podcast, Yesterday's Heroes, covers all sports.
Honestly, what are you bringing to the table, Beaver?
The knowledge.
Let's test it. How many test wickets did Uak McGrath take?
563.
How many laps around Mount Panorama?
I told you this the other week, 161.
As usual, I wasn't listening to you. Who's winning the Ashes?
Well, that's up to us to debate.
No debate. We'll absolutely romp it in, so listen to me for your tips.
And to me to sound sports smart.
Well, listen to both of us. Subscribe to Yesterday's Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
New episodes every Thursday, thanks to PointsBet.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Thursday, May 25th. Ever since Scott Morrison was booted from the office of Prime Minister exactly a year ago on Sunday, the rumour mill has been in overdrive. When will he leave politics? He's now the most watched backbencher in federal politics. Morrison's every move is watched and analysed by enemies and supporters alike for any sign of what he might do next. Calls for his resignation have been coming since Morrison was accused of undermining our democracy. That was last year when we found out that he had secretly appointed himself to 5 senior ministries when he was in power. Today, National Affairs Editor James Massola on what happens when a former Prime Minister won't exit stage left. So, James, it's now been 12 months since Scott Morrison was booted out of office. And since then, there has been a lot of speculation that the former Prime Minister, is going to leave. But of course, he hasn't left politics yet. So just how unusual is this to see a former Prime Minister stick around after being voted out of office?
Look, it is actually quite unusual, Sam. Over the last 30 years or so, we've seen Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard and Malcolm Turnbull all leave within a matter of a couple of months.
I'll be leaving the Parliament not before too long. Okay. As I've always said.
John Howard was one exception. He was booted from office. He lost Bennelong when they lost the Liberal Party the 2007 election.
Say this, that I accept full responsibility for the Liberal Party campaign and I therefore accept full responsibility for the Coalition's defeat in this election campaign.
The only sort of proper exception to the rule has been Tony Abbott, who hung around for about four and a bit years after losing the Prime Ministership.
I still have a contribution to make to our public life. Being a backbench member of Parliament, it's a noble and an honourable calling.
Now what we're seeing with Scott Morrison, the anniversary passed a couple of days ago. He's still there. It's been a year. And what really strikes me is that, few Liberals will say it publicly, but there is a sense that many of them do want him to move on. So the party can start to move on and continue to rebuild. So the question then remains, why hasn't he exited the political stage yet?
Right, and there have been several junctures in the past year when Morrison was expected to go, but controversially he didn't. So can you briefly tell me about some of those moments?
Yeah, look, initially people thought Morrison would leave almost immediately, like many of his predecessors did. After the multiple ministries scandal, which was in August last year, there were a few MPs, Karen Andrews being notably one of them, who were willing to say publicly, all right, time to draw a line, this guy has to leave Parliament. But he didn't go. At that stage, the theory was he would quietly quit just before the end of 2022, have a by-election just before Christmas, and therefore not take away from the looming New South Wales state election campaign. He'd make sure that there was clear air for that to be held in March this year, I believe it was. That didn't happen again. And of course, he wasn't going to do it at the same time as Dominic Perrottet went to voters because that could have enmeshed sort of state and federal issues, been a distraction and what have you. So the theory has been, again and again, it's imminent, but he hasn't gone yet.
Right. And so can we unpack maybe a few of the reasons why he's choosing to stay? What have we heard from Morrison himself? what does he say is his motivation for remaining on?
So the few times I've spoken to him for these sort of various stories I've done about it, Sam, he's said to me, he's quite relaxed about where he is at the moment, that he gets a bit more time with his wife and kids, which of course, as compared to being Prime Minister, backbenchers do. He's got more time to tend to his electorate. He's got time to go and see his beloved Sharkies in the NRL. He time to cook up some of his curries, the infamous curries that he posts to Facebook on a Saturday night. So he's in a pretty good place. And he's been pretty quiet in the Parliament, but he is starting to play a bit of a mentoring role with younger Liberal MPs who've, in some cases, just come to the Parliament. In some have been there for a couple of terms, but have never been in opposition before. So in that sense, and his allies as well present a kind of pretty good face to it all. Like, things are going along well, nothing to see here, no rush to leave. But there are some more cynical theories around why he's hanging about.
Okay, interesting. So can you take us through some of those cynical theories then?
Sure. I mean, he's looking for work. That much is very clear. He's been knocked back by a couple of different major companies. I'm told a big defence company in the UK has been considering hiring him, which would give him an ongoing income. Because don't forget, Sam, his girls are sort of teenagers, they're at school. You know, he's not a wealthy man in the way that Malcolm Turnbull was, and he doesn't get a pension until he's 60. So he needs to make a living. And I think he's keen to leave. I think he's putting a brave face on things. I'm sure it's all true that he does enjoy being a backbench MP and all of that still, but I think were he given an exit route, he'd take it, and he'd take it fairly quickly because, I mean, he's the most watched backbencher in federal parliament, Sam. Every time he does something, people are keeping an eye on him. There's that speculation attached to him. You know, there's that cohort of Australians, significant cohort, a majority, who voted him out. And, you know, it must be uncomfortable for him. So there's that sense that he probably does want to leave. It's just a question of when. But regardless of the motivation, Sam, we know for sure that Morrison's decision is making many members of the Liberal Party uneasy, and that his choice to stay could have big implications for Peter Dutton's leadership.
Okay, and so can you help us understand why Scott Morrison's decision to stay could be bad for the Liberal Party and for opposition leader Peter Dutton?
Well, I think it's bad for the Liberal Party in terms of the distraction that it creates for Peter Dutton and for the party more broadly. It says, you know, here's this guy that was voted out by a big majority of Australians, or his government, I should say, was voted out by a big majority of Australians. Because don't forget, Labor only got, I think, to 76 of 151 seats. But if you add in the extra Greens seats, if you add the Teal seats in, you're starting to get up towards a progressive big majority of around 90 seats. So in that sense, he's a distraction. And then, of course, the other factor here, if you like, is it's a distraction for Peter Dutton, but there's a risk for Peter Dutton when he goes, in much the same way as Alan Tudge's resignation. I mean, that was a catastrophe. That was the first by-election lost by an opposition to a government in 100 years. Now, I don't think Morrison's seat of Cook would be lost. I don't think Stuart Roberts' seat of Fadden will be lost. The margins in those seats are around 62% on the two-party preferred, but a 5 or 6% swing against one or other of them is big trouble for Dutton, because it says, you know, potentially the opposition leader is still on the nose, he's not cutting through, and he has, you know, some leadership difficulties of his own. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, right, okay. And so I wanted to turn to Scott Morrison's legacy. You wrote that Morrison believes that securing the AUKUS agreement will be the capstone of his political career. But how do you think the broader Australian public will reflect on his time as Prime Minister? Like, what do you think they'll remember most about his time?
It's going to be, I think, a mixed legacy, Sam. I think there's going to be a lot of Australians who won't forget, you know, the slow rollout of the vaccine, who aren't going to forget that awful summer when you couldn't get a rat to cross the border to go and see the family that you hadn't seen for 6 months or 12 months. Those sorts of decisions, I think, are going to haunt him for a long time. I think there were some mistakes made with JobKeeper in terms of how much money went out that have a budgetary impact that we're still feeling. But I also think in 10 years' time, 5 years' time, we'll look back and think, well, you know, border closures, that was probably right. Some of the stoushing with the states, that was probably a bit over the top. But, you know, they were making things up on the go, on the fly. And on the whole, they did a reasonably good job of insulating Australia from the initial waves of COVID when we had the borders shut. They managed that pretty well.
And what about bushfires? I know that for me is the one that really sticks out like an absolute sore thumb. 2019, 2020 New South Wales bushfires. Do you think that's going to really hang over him, or do you think that will recede?
No, I think maybe, maybe not for the majority of the population, but I think for a pretty significant cohort of people, that "I don't hold a hose, mate," that line will haunt him for the rest of his career. I mean, there are Liberals who believe that was the moment, that comment, at which the public perception of Morrison was set. And don't forget, perceptions set like cement. Once people have made your mind up, it's very, very hard to change it. Mm. He had an initial reprieve in those first months of the pandemic where his approval ratings soared. But what "I don't hold a hose" said, you could kind of draw a line from that to it's not a race on the vaccines, to sort of not taking responsibility for ordering enough rapid antigen tests. That was the thing, I think, the thing that killed him, was a series of comments or his handling of situations where he didn't take responsibility. And I think that's fundamentally why he was voted from office.
Yeah, right. And I'm curious about what happens to politicians when they do stick around longer than they should. I mean, you mentioned Tony Abbott sticking around for quite a long time earlier in the conversation. So I'm just wondering, historically, does it have a habit of hurting a politician's legacy? Perhaps even their future career prospects? I mean, is there a chance that sticking around could hurt Morrison himself?
That's a really tough question, Sam. There is a potential risk, I think. It depends what he does while he's still in the chamber. If he were to start, destabilising Peter Dutton, throwing bombs, popping up on Sky or ABC regularly, that would obviously risk his reputation. And I think that's what we saw happen with Tony Abbott, is that he was on the backbench doing those things, trying to tear down Malcolm Turnbull, and it was damaging. Morrison hasn't indicated a sort of willingness or an inclination to do that at this point in time. I think the other risk is for former Prime Ministers who do get out of Parliament, they can't quite let go. They keep coming back. And you see that with Kevin Rudd, you see that with Malcolm Turnbull, you see that with John Howard and Tony Abbott. They all seem to enjoy weighing in on national affairs. And I guess when you've done that job, you are well informed. You do have an opinion on just about everything. I think most regular Australians would probably like a couple of former PMs to be a bit more like Julia Gillard, who's kept a near monastic silence and gone on to do some interesting work.
And in terms of what Morrison does next, you mentioned earlier that a couple of companies have knocked him back, I think you said. What do you think he will finally do when he finally chooses to move on? And do you think he'll take that Julia Gillard type silence?
Yeah, in terms of what he does work-wise, Sam, there's been a bit of reporting around a job or a consulting role rather at PwC, the financial services company that he was knocked back from. There's this defence position with a major UK company that I've been told is still a live option. He's joined the Centre for New American Security, which is a really well-regarded think tank based in Washington, set up by a couple of Democrats who worked for Barack Obama. But it's very much a bipartisan think tank, and that's why, again, I sort of think he's going to hang his hat on and focus his post-political work on things related to AUKUS and defence, because it's easily the most significant thing I think he's done. Will he be a bit more like Julia Gillard? He'd probably hate me to say it, but I think he will be. It was certainly his friends say to me, he doesn't want to be that Prime Minister who's intervening all the time in national debate. I think when he's done, he'll be done.
Interesting. Okay, so we're not going to see him at the National Press Club like Paul Keating, just like absolutely hammering.
Throwing Molotov cocktails? Yeah, no, hopefully not.
James, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this. It's fascinating.
Yeah, pleasure to chat, Sam. Thank you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Margaret Gordon. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
I'm a lady Chase.
And I'm Tom. As Oscar Wilde once said,
ultimately the bond of all companionship, whether in marriage or in friendship, is conversation.
Welcome to our husband-wife podcast, The Elliott Exchange. What could possibly go wrong?
Find out with us by tapping the follow or subscribe button on The Elliott Exchange, wherever you get your podcast.